So as we cover RESTful routes, we'll be thinking back to HTTP verbs, Crud, URLs, and all the things we've learned there and kind of build on that knowledge. So I have some warm-up questions here for you all that I'm going to drop into your cohort channel, and I'll send you into breakout rooms for about 5 minutes just to discuss these. We'll come back and talk about the answers as a group just to get us going and get us warmed up for today. So give me 1 second to get all that set up. I'll put you into breakout rooms and then I'll post these questions to your cohort channel. And you are all just going to be discussing, like talking through the answers for each of these bullet points. Okay. Those should be open, and check your channel shortly, or the slides if you prefer to look at the slides for the questions.
Whoops. I hit enter right as I went to breakout room, so
It
I'm here.
happens. Welcome back. All right, welcome back, everybody. Can you see my screen where I'm editing the slide? Cool, cool. All right, I'm going to call in a couple of brave volunteers to answer some of these questions, and you can answer or phone a friend. So first up, what are the 5 common HTTP verbs and how do they map to our CRUD actions? Let's hear from Alex F.
I knew it was going to be me. So those are the like the get, post, patch, right? Get, post, patch. Oh no. Phoning anyone, literally anyone. Help.
Delete, destroy, delete, destroy.
Delete, destroy.
Okay, let's say delete. We have one more HTTP verb here. Does anybody know it? You can go ahead and shout it out.
But
All right, thanks.
And then they match up. The create, I think, is the post.
Cool. Yep.
The read is the get.
Okay. Yep.
Update, I think, is the patch, and maybe put also, but I'm not
You got it.
really sturdy on that one.
Yep.
And then delete and just delete.
Yep.
Word.
And we can also, there's some, we'll be thinking destroy in a lot of Rails contexts too, right? So yeah, this is the 5 common HTTP verbs and how they map to our CRUD actions that a user would want to do in our app. Thank you. Noah?
What's put do? I'm still fuzzy on the difference between that and put patch.
Yeah, so actually I'll reorder these so that they're next to each other. Just makes a little bit more sense. So patch is going to update part of a record and put is going to update the whole thing. So you can think of patch as going in and usually editing just one field or updating one field, and put will update the entirety of the field, like all of the attributes. Yeah, so we really don't use put a whole lot, but it is something that will update a record for us or update a resource for us. Cool. Does that answer your question, Noah?
Does it all? It doesn't also update the ID, right? The ID stays the same.
Correct. Okay. As far as I know, because we would never want to override the auto incremented ID with like a Postgres database. As far as like HTTP in a broader context, as far as I know, in like all of HTTP, aside from Rails, aside from Postgres, put would not update an ID because that's not a field we would ordinarily be updating. It would update every field that is meant to be updated. That's my understanding, at least. Mark?
just to follow up, so with patch, can you, I guess like it only updates one field, but it doesn't, like, can you use patch to update all fields? Or
That's a good question. That's a good question. My hunch is that it is possible for like, especially if we think about what we're doing in Rails, to take a patch request and do multiple things with that patch request by the time we get to the controller, including updating more than one field. But as far as HTTP is concerned, it's only meant for updating a part of a resource. So that could mean a variety of things. It could mean one piece, or yeah, I would think of this as maybe a better way to say it is patch updates part of a resource and put updates the whole thing, regardless of whether the information has changed or not.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Further follow-up or clarifying questions or anything before we move on from these HTTP verbs and how they map to CRUD? All good questions. Thank you, folks. All right. Let's answer the second part of this warm-up exercise, and I will call in somebody for this as well. Feel free to phone a friend. Lawrence, what is the, we'll go one at a time with these. What is the URI in this example of the URL? Do we have a Lawrence?
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I just was coughing really hard for
No.
a second.
No worries.
Believe it's the oh god. I think that the URI is going to just be the taskmanager.hero.com part,
This
or
part.
is
Not
yeah.
quite.
No.
Feel free to take another guess or bump to a friend. We're just looking for the URI.
I think I should probably bump to Alex.
Okay, yeah, Alex, you have your hand up. Which part's the URI?
Yeah. I think it's the task and new, like /task
Gotcha.
/new.
Right here.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, let's say that. And I think we could probably consider it everything after that slash. But for the time being, for this exercise, we'll say it's this part right here. And let me put that here. Okay, let's see, I'll call on somebody for the protocol. So if you're thinking about which part is the protocol, Joe R. Joe Ray.
It's HTTP.
HTTP, yep, thank you. So this part is what we would call the protocol. All right, let's think about the domain. Which part of this URL is the domain germane? Germane here today. And I think we will bump to a friend. Molly, which part is the domain?
Task/manager.herokuapp.com.
All of this, yep. Awesome. And I'll take a volunteer for the query string. Does anybody know how we would define this part? You want to raise your hand? Richard.
It's everything after the question mark.
Yep, there we go. So the question mark shows us, hey, we're starting a query string. We'll go down to here, and I will just go up until task because we do have an anchor tag here as well. We probably won't get into that just now. And I guess just for completion's sake, we'll say that this is the anchor tag. This is basically telling the request, hey, there's an element on the page called with an ID of new form anchor. Scroll down to that when you get to this page, when you finish processing the request. So that's a kind of a recap of the anatomy of a URL. Alex, do you have a question or something to add?
Yeah, I have a question, and this might be like really minutia and like off the rails, but when I used to do like low-key Facebook marketing stuff, if we tried to use a URL that had a question mark in it, Facebook wouldn't let you use it in an ad. Like if you clicked on the link through Facebook, you had to go up to the URL and delete the everything after the question mark. Like, do you know why? Like, does the query string like change depending on stuff? Like, I always just thought that was weird and I didn't understand what was going on. And this is the first time I've seen it. And again, if it's like way off topic, I don't need to know. I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that's kind of getting into the weeds of SEO and how that works. My guess would be that the Facebook ads, they probably have certain restrictions to make sure you only use ads in a certain way that are like beneficial to Facebook or whatever the case may be. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but I would think that query params would easily be one of the things that they would restrict, because theoretically you can pass anything to query params and try to get different resources and stuff like that. But yeah, I don't have a very thorough answer, but that's a good question. It gets you thinking about what query params are really doing. Yeah, if you are super interested in that stuff, I'd continue to look up like SEO and different policies that companies have about how that works, because that's what that sounds like to me. Cool. All right, I have some slides that I want to get into before we take a POM, and then we'll have an exercise to talk about REST and what RESTful routing is and all that. So let me actually just switch up my screen share real quick. All right, and we have gotten through this warm up. We are here. 1 second, sorry, everybody, please hold. All right. So we've been talking a lot about resources, and it's probably worth mentioning again, what are resources and what is a resource in the context of RESTful routing? And this is something that we have in our application. It could be tasks, could be people, it could be movies. So we can think of resources and also think of models, right? We talk about resources and thinking of data that is stored in the database. And each database table is a resource. So for every table that we have in our database, we have a corresponding model in Rails, and we have a corresponding resource to think about when we're looking at our routes. So every row or entry in a database table is a specific instance of a resource. Just a little bit of terminology to get us started. And then talking about URIs, the first piece of terminology to really know and be comfortable with is Uniform Resource Locator, that's URL. And then URI is Uniform Resource Identifier. So the Uniform Resource Locator, or the URL, it's like the general address, the thing we type into the browser to go somewhere, or the entirety of what we would see if this request was typed out in the browser. The URI is a identifier for a particular resource. And it's the part of the URL after the domain, like we just discussed. Here it would be /wiki/uniform_resource_identifier. And yeah, that's what I was mentioning. It identifies a particular resource. Molly?
Yeah, just to clarify, so when we're talking about a resource, I think the last slide I went by quickly, but it's like you're talking about like the table. So when you're saying like puts versus patch, it's like puts would update the whole table. That's what the difference. Okay, cool.
I would, so let me rephrase that to be more clear. I think, yeah, we can think of resource in general as, I tend to think of the term resource in these contexts very similar to how I think about the word model. So depending upon how we talk about it, model could mean like the class, like all instances of the model, or it could say, hey, I'm going to update that model with this ID. That would be a single instance. And resource, I think from my experiences, treated the same way, where typically when we say resource, we're talking about the whole thing, the whole table, all of the records of a certain type. But if I say, oh, I'm making an HTTP put request to /tasks/ID, that's going to update all of that one record, that's going to update the entirety of that one instance of the resource. So
okay, so it's like somewhat used for both. Okay.
Yeah, but if you're thinking of a put request, the thing I really want to clarify there, a put request would still be for yeah, it could be for one resource, or it could be for you could be working with a collection of resources. But yeah, does that clear it up a little bit? I know that some of the terminology has overlap and it can be a little bit confusing.
Yeah, I guess I was just confused because we were talking about like which columns kind of they would update, but like we've been obviously using patch to update all the columns, or like theoretically all of our columns at once. So versus like, yeah, but then it makes sense that it would be different potentially if you were updating a collection of resources, like a bunch of people or movies or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. If I can clarify on that further, y'all can raise your hand at any point, because I realize it's not the simplest thing in the world, all these like new terms. Cool, so we talked about URIs. This is an overview here. Yep, the URL being the Uniform Resource Locator, the URI being the Uniform Resource Identifier, and I think we are good to carry on here. 9:24, all right, we got a little bit of time. So now we actually, 30 minutes in, we actually get to talking about REST. And this is some background information that's good to know. Representational state transfer is what REST stands for. And it's a web architecture style. So it's a way that we choose to style our code in order to communicate certain things about it. This is best practice for building routes in Rails, and we want to make our routes RESTful whenever we possibly can. So this term was coined by somebody named Roy Fielding in the year 2000, and RESTful applications typically treat the web like a resource. So as we're thinking, we have all this conversation about what is a resource? Is it one record? Is it a whole table? We can also think about the web as a resource that can be interacted with. So this isn't making a ton of sense right now. That's okay. This is just a little bit of background information before we get into the weeds with REST, just some terminology to be aware of. representational state transfer. I'll leave this here for a second in case people are taking notes. Okay. Moving on. Oh, and REST is a simple way to organize interactions between independent systems. So to be clear, we don't have to use RESTful routes. We can build a Rails application without adhering to REST, but REST is the best practice as far as how we organize our routes so that it makes sense to other programmers what our routes file is doing. Along that line, REST is a convention. So one thing we say in the Rails community a lot is convention over configuration, meaning Rails has a certain way that things are just kind of done so that we don't have to think about it. It's less cognitive resources for us to spend deciding how our routes file should work. So we use conventions so that others can understand easily and also to just kind of help us make some of those decisions. And REST and routes you can think of as a map between HTTP verb path combinations and then the actual CRUD user actions that users want to perform on a resource. So we've talked about this a little bit in practice when we look at our routes file and how we take the combination of the HTTP verb and the path or the URI, and then we map it to a controller action. This is some more of the terminology about what we're doing there and why. We're mapping a verb path combination to a CRUD action that a user wants to perform. We'll go a little bit longer and then I think we'll try to take a break right at 9:30. So in RESTful design, URIs have specific patterns that we can expect. And here's kind of an introduction to that. A generic example of one of these specific patterns in RESTful design would be for getting all of a particular resources, the URI would be /resources. And then to get a specific instance of a resources that that convention would be /resources/ID. So we're already sort of asking you all to do REST and build RESTful routes when you're hand rolling your routes in your project, but we haven't necessarily talked about why we do it that way or what the convention is until today. And here's an example for something more specific, like a dog. To get all the dogs, you would have a route defined that would say /dogs, and that would be the RESTful convention to use the name of the resource, make it pluralized, and just have that as the URI. And then notice the pluralization here. To get a specific instance of the dog resource, you would have a URI that is /dogs plural / and then the ID of whichever dog you're trying to retrieve. So even when we're only working with one particular resource in our routes, like getting a dog with a specific ID, or maybe getting an edit form for a record with a specific ID, we're still going to use the pluralized name of the resource as our first segment of that route. And that's what we expect in RESTful convention. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and go through this slide and then I'll leave it up while we take our POM. In RESTful design, the HTTP verb indicates what we're doing with a resource, while the URI specifies what resource we're interacting with. Get will retrieve a resource like we talked about earlier. Post will create a new resource. Put updates an entire resource. So whichever resource you're updating, it's going to look at that as one thing and update it in its entirety. Patch will update part of a resource. So could be one piece, could be whichever pieces of the resource that you are asking it to update. And then delete will remove or destroy a resource. Alex.
Yeah, just to clarify, I'm thinking about like Noah's question. When you say resource, you mean row in a database, right? So like putting another row on is post.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, patch just is like a patchwork, like updates a piece of it. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
okay.
That's how I would think about it. Yeah. So for any of these, we're thinking about an individual request coming in and we're doing some stuff with our RESTful routes and it gets mapped to a controller action to do some CRUD stuff. We can think of this as, just think about this as one thing at a time where the user is actually interacting and doing these CRUD pieces. yeah, I think that's where I'll pause on that for now so that we can take a palm and come back together at 9:35.
Where'd you get the hoodie?
It's my Baphomet onesie. You see the?
Ooh, nice.
I have to step up my onesie game because Lee's shark onesie is so dope.
It is pretty dope, but it's not the end of the world. So I think you've got one up now.
Exactly.
All right, just a reminder for everybody as we come back from the palm, if you could either have your video, turn your video back on or give me a reaction so I have an idea of who's back. That's super helpful. Thank you. Awesome. Give it a second for a couple more people, but I will get my screen share set up. Cool. All right, so we've done quite a bit of reviewing. We've introduced a little bit of new terminology. Let's put it all together. So we have a URI, which tells us which resource or what resource we are pointing to, interacting with, however you want to think of that. We have the HTTP verb, which communicates what we want to do to or with that resource. The verb path URL combo will indicate what CRUD action a user wants to take. And these things all put together are known as Restful Routes. For example, we have delete /dog/5, which means we are going to destroy the dog with the ID of 5. We have post/dogs, which is going to create a new dog. We have get dogs, which is going to show all the dogs. We have get dog/2, which shows one dog, the dog with the ID of 2. And those are some examples for kind of putting all these things together into one slide. Yeah, Jameson.
Can you speak a little bit to, I guess, the high level benefit for choosing specific HTTP verbs? From my perspective, I've done update and delete using post before, and it works fine. So I'm wondering what synergy can you get for like combining all those things together?
Gotcha. As far as using the HTTP verb, that is bigger than just the convention of a RESTful route or the convention of Rails or anything like that. That's just how the internet communicates and how we're expected to interact with the internet. If we think about the internet as a resource, there will be certain restrictions. I think right now it might not be super clear, but ideally it would never be possible to like delete something with a post. Now that gets a little bit more complicated because you might see things as we work through different pieces of the views. You might see things with a form that is like, if you go in and inspect your form in the browser, for instance, you might see that it has a post, but then there's another field in that form somewhere that overrides that automatic like post that is set up with the helper. And it's like, oh, this is actually a patch request. So how do I answer this succinctly? I think it could be possible to complete certain actions without using the appropriate HTTP verb, but in general, just with working with the web, it's not bad practice. And I think as you get into more complicated interactions with HTTP requests, such as dealing with different domains or maybe working with an API, that kind of thing, the verbs are going to be taken pretty seriously, as well as the response codes that are being returned back for a certain type of request. So as far as the verb, we just kind of have to use what we're expected to use as far as the language of the internet. And then the specific combinations that we're getting to here with REST, that's more of a convention that we follow as Rails developers. And REST is not specific to Rails, but it is an easy way for us to organize our routes so that people know what the heck we're talking about and what we're doing with our resources. There's probably more to be said about your question, but does that give like a little bit of context or an answer? Do you have any follow-up, Jameson?
No, not right now. Thank you, though.
No problem. Richard?
And this is more like a question similar to Jameson's, like with the internet before RESTful, was the internet only using just get and post? And why is that why like forms only use get and post?
I'm getting with these questions a little bit out of like my knowledge of expertise, but from my understanding, HTTP verbs are older and older than REST and likely more widely adhered to and used than REST. REST is a thing that came out, like we said earlier, in the 2000s, or I think 2000 exactly. And HTTP verbs and communication would have already existed by then. But as far as like forms, mainly using post, I would guess that post was something that predated things like patch, and that as it grew more complicated, more HTTP verbs were invented. I don't know for sure though. That's not really
Okay.
an area that I'm super
Yeah.
knowledgeable, but
Yeah, I was just curious, like why forums only have get and post, and I just think that's kind of strange.
yeah. Brian might be able to speak to that in more detail than I can if he's still here. Anything to add?
I wish I had some more context on this, but I don't.
Same.
Yeah, I agree, Richard. I think it is strange that for whatever reason, it doesn't seem like the other verbs you can use on forms. I forget when we looked at it, but we'll see that like Rails adds that like hidden input to fake it. And I really don't know why. Something else that you might run into is you might see like when you try to create a delete button, it'll work on your local server, but not on Heroku for some reason. Like the Heroku stack doesn't recognize it as a delete verb. Yeah, there are just some like weird gotchas, but I don't exactly know why they happen.
Yep, agreed. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, any other questions coming up before we move on? Cool. All right. So now we have an activity. It is 9:40. We have about 20 minutes left. So I want to send you all out into breakout rooms and give you about 10 minutes to do this. You'll be go ahead and pull up Task Manager, because you'll be looking at your routes file for Task Manager. And you'll be answering the question, what are the 7 different method, path, controller, action combinations? And what does each one do? We have this template linked in the slides as well as the lesson plan. If you're looking for it in the lesson plan, it's right here underneath the heading 7 Restful Routes. It should look something like this. You'll make a copy or diagram this in your notebook. Either one is fine. I think this actually, I'll do this as an individual activity since we're a little bit pushed on time. So you'll be doing the 7 routes. There's one already done for you. You'll be listing what the verb is, what the path is, what controller it's going to, what action in that controller it's going to, and the end result, the behavior that we're looking to create. So go ahead and take a few minutes to do that, and then we'll come back together as a large group and fill out our own copy of the diagram. I'm going to set a timer for myself for 10 minutes, and you all can feel free to just work on this individually, cameras on or off. We'll come back together at 9:53 to talk about this. Any questions about the activity? All right, have fun.
Hey, Jameson, how do we get to the template?
I'm about to put it there. It's in the slides and in the lesson plan, but I'm about to put it in your Zoom chat as well. And if you want to do this digitally, you'll need to make a copy, but you can also do this in your notebook. Hey, everybody, just checking in. Could I get a hand raise reaction if you are done with this activity? Okay. Cool. All right. Thank you all. We will go ahead and give it another 3 minutes. All right, let's come back together. Hopefully you got a chance to get this most of the way finished. If not, that's okay. We can always bump to a friend when I call on people. And by the end of today's class, we'll have a complete diagram in the slides link for you to reference. So we already have here our get tasks to the task controller with the index action, and it shows all the tasks. I'm going to call on somebody to share another one. Natia, could we walk through an additional row to this chart?
We could, but I've got somebody doing construction behind me, so it might be really loud.
That's okay. We'll work through the one row and totally get it.
Okay. So let me jump to my spreadsheet. So I had a get / nothing else as the welcome controller. And that is an index action. I shouldn't have picked this one. I'm pretty sure that shows you the link to get into tasks, but I forget what it actually did.
Cool. Would it be fair to call this like a landing page?
Yeah, that
or
would
home page. Yeah,
be a better description. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, cool. That's one I wasn't necessarily expecting because we're not talking about the tasks resource, but I'm glad you brought it up anyway. Thank you, Nitu. Let me take a volunteer to go to another one. So we might end up with more than 7, and that's okay. Joanna? Could we work through another one that you have? Hi, hello.
Yeah, so I also have get / tasks, controller, task controller, action new. And what does that action new do? I'm gonna guess that I'm not sure what that action does, honestly.
Gotcha. Okay, so this would be an example of and this was all done like before we even got into class with Task Manager, right? So no worries here, but this would be something I would describe as probably, let's see, wait, let me think through this. We have get task. I'm going to move this one down so that I'm thinking more clearly. Cool. So we have get / tasks. And you said that this was the entirety of the path, right? There was nothing else after that, and it was going to the new action.
Sorry, it was tasks / new.
Got it. I may have misheard there. No worries. So yeah, that's what I would expect. I would think that would be RESTful. So this would be a get tasks new. It goes to the task controller, the new action. Does anybody want to chime in on what they expect this RESTful route to do? Richard?
It returns a form to fill out a new task.
Yeah. Or we'll say shows a form for creating a new task. Cool. Let's keep moving for the sake of time. I'll go to Regina. Do you have another RESTful route you could share with us here?
Was there a list that everyone's pulling from? Because I kind of guess I think I did it wrong. Because I was going through the different methods. Oh, there's not?
No worries. I was going to say we were looking at the routes file for Task Manager. And feel free to bump to a friend if you feel like this is not the exercise you did. That's totally okay.
I'll try and we'll see.
Yeah, let's hear our guess.
I'll try patch maybe.
Patch, okay.
Method patch.
And what would be the path for that?
The path would be /tasks /edit, right?
/edit.
That's it.
Is that what do you? I don't know if you have your routes file up in front of you.
I can open it. Yeah, let me actually open it.
And we can continue thinking through the rest of it. So once you get that open, let's verify the path is what you want it to be, and then we'll go on to what controller that's mapping to.
So patch, okay. So the path would be tasks / and it would be like the ID or the, yeah.
Gotcha. So like that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
What
Right?
controllers?
Okay.
Yeah. Looks good to me so far. What controller are we going to?
Is it still the tasks controller?
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. What action?
Update.
And then what do you expect this to do for us as a user?
It will update an existing task.
Mm-hmm. And specifically, whichever ID we pass, it's going to update that task, right? Awesome. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
All right.
Awesome. We're kind of running low on time, but I want to try to call on one more person. Susie, do you have another one to share with us?
Yeah, post.
Okay.
And that would track to /tasks for the path and the task controller. The action would be create. And it creates and saves new tasks.
A new task. Yep, that's great. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and kind of rush through these. We're running low on time, but I would expect to see something like for the rest of this. We also need a delete, and that would have a path probably of a tasks and then a specific ID of which one we want to delete. It would go to the tasks controller, and it would go to destroy. And what it would do is destroy the task with whichever ID that we passed here. And that makes sense so far. I'm going to insert a row below. And I think the only one, we're missing here would be very similar to how we have a get tasks new and going to the task controller new, and it's showing a form for creating a new task. We would also need a get to tasks And then we need to know which task we're editing. So that would have an ID. And then it would say edit. We would have tasks controller. It would go to the edit action now instead of the update. And what it does is shows a form for editing the task. And that would be the task that we pass through with our URI. Okay, I do have a few more slides to get through here. There's a couple of things I want to mention, and then I will turn it over because I know Brian has the next class that's technically starting now. But just a couple of things to talk about before we wrap up today. Sometimes we do need to create routes that don't fit into the RESTful framework. We might have like this example here. Maybe we want to deactivate an item. We could say patch items ID, and the question here to ask ourselves is, does this conflict with a regular update? I think in some examples, maybe it does. In some examples, maybe it does not. But in the case that it does, we might need a non-RESTful route. We might call it something like patch items ID deactivate or patch items ID toggle. And really what I want to emphasize here is that we're hoping that you all will try to keep things RESTful whenever you can. In most cases, you should be able to keep your routes very RESTful, and occasionally something might come up that is not as RESTful. Like these two routes that are listed here, these are just ideas of things that would be routes that are not adhering to REST in the way that we've talked about so far today. Aaliyah.
Sorry, I know we're low on time, but would you
Okay.
mind talking through a little bit more about like why those are not RESTful?
Sure. When we think about RESTful routes, basically the things that go into that are the HTTP verb, and then the resource that we're looking to target, and then any applicable ID for that resource if we're looking for a specific record. And then beyond that, anything that we're adding to our route, especially that is not like something that is just part of the URI and not part of the query params, especially. Like deactivate and toggle, these mean nothing within the context of REST as a convention. So yeah, this would be anything custom. If I had a route that was something like patch toggle item / ID, that would also not be RESTful. So REST basically is limited to our verb path combination, this very specific, like our resource in the plural form, and then any relevant ID or IDs. And that kind of is a good segue actually into what happens if we have more than one resource that we're working with for a particular route. Well, at this point in Mod 2, you will probably come across this pretty quickly, where we have a parent and a child, and both of them are involved in some sort of request that we're trying to make. So think for a second about how you would define a route for this user story. And we have like an answer on the next slide, but try to just think in your head without looking at an example. When I visit a shelter show page and I click on all pets at this shelter, then I'm taken to an index page which shows all the pets for a given shelter. So now we are looking to get a collection of pets, but we also need to involve one specific instance of a shelter. And we can do this with something that we call a nested route. So I'm going to go ahead and click onto here. So the first route involved here is get shelters ID to shelters show. This is visiting the shelter show page. This is a lot like the routes that we've talked about in our examples so far. But then when we click on all pets at this shelter, that's going to kick off a new request that would go to, oops, forgot my slash, shelters, shelter ID. So the convention is to name this with the name of the parent and then underscore ID instead of just underscore ID. And that the convention there is that the ID follows whatever resource we put first. So we have our shelters resource, and then we need to specify a specific shelter ID, and then we can go on to pets. We can go on to the child index, and then this would go to the shelters controller pets, or perhaps it goes to a pets controller index. Don't want to spend too much time here, but I do want to introduce the concept of a nested route and the RESTful way to put one of those together. And that this would be a really good example of that. Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead. There are a couple more slides here. This is just another example of a nested route. This is what it would look like in set list. And then at the end, there's a slide that this is just nice to know information. If you feel like looking this up in in the Rails docs on your own time, that's totally fine, but this is not need to know. This is just something that you might see in routes files, keyword namespace. But again, not particularly crucial to this lesson, where I just wanted to make sure I got to nested routes. Cool. I'll go ahead and wrap up here unless we have any questions about that we can cover first about the lesson today. Lee.
In the lesson plan, I thought that it had indicated that it was a shortcut in terminal that could give us what we were looking for. I was just wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing that shortcut really fast.
Sure. That's a really good shortcut to know of and to use anytime that you're debugging something related to routes. And that is, I'm putting it in chat, just Rails routes. And that will, if you run that in your terminal in the directory of your project, it'll give you some output about what your routes are and where they map to and all that good stuff. Really handy. Aaliyah, did you have another question?
I did, yeah. Just
Cool.
kind of going back to the first question where we talked about restfulness being just the resource and then like some kind of ID. Is that specific to the ID attribute? Or like if, for example, we had a shelter that had a Boolean column that was like open or closed, and we wanted to show the route might be like shelters /:ID / like open or closed, whatever that column is called. Would that be RESTful, calling two attributes in a?
I would consider that to be not RESTful.
Okay, so it's specific to the ID being the kind of like RESTful attribute that we call.
Yeah, so to my understanding, when we're building RESTful routes, really the only dynamic segments, that's how I would refer to the part where we have like :ID or :resource name _ID. We want to limit that to IDs. And there are other ways that you can create a URL that has more specific information, like, hey, I want to filter this to show only the open records or only the closed records. There are other ways to do that, but I would consider putting it into the actual URI. That would be a non-RESTful route. Natia?
So I posted this in Code Help, but it seems to me like RESTful routes are very specific. They have a very specific path and a very specific action in controller. So why does it matter the order you put them in your file?
The main reason it would matter is that that file is evaluated by Ruby the same way that any other file would be, and that is line by line. So theoretically, you could have two URIs that are the same but have different verbs, and whichever one matches first could be like attempted by your program. So yeah, that would be the only reason I would think it would matter. And for instance, I think a common one that you would run into is like trying to get something and instead of like the dynamic portion of the route reads your /new as an ID instead of saying, oh, this is the route that takes me to a new form. So that's the main thing I would watch out for there. But other than that, the order doesn't matter. Okay, I have time, I think, for one more question before I wrap it up here. Regina?
I just wanted to repeat what I thought I heard.
Yeah.
Did you say that the routes, like the order, the gets and the posts and the patch, those all have to be in an order because it goes to the next line, basically? Or no, is that not, did I hear wrong?
So I think the only time that order would be an issue is if, for example, you got a request for that you would expect to be taking you to a show page, and that would be get /tasks/ID, right? But what if you make a get request to /tasks/new to try to get a new form for a new task? The routes file would basically say, hey, that segment there, that can be anything. I'm calling it :ID, but it could be new, it could be foo/barbaz, it could be 5. So you would want to order your routes file in such a way that the new doesn't get interpreted as that dynamic segment, because at the end of the day, if that happened, then Rails is going to try to look up a record with the ID of new. So just keep in mind that your routes file goes in order. It's sequential order, line by line.
Okay, I was more of thinking like it goes get, post, get, patch, delete. but you're talking about the actual. Okay, never mind. I heard it in a different way, but I understand what you're trying to say.
Okay, glad that was helpful to clarify. Cool. Yeah, thank you all for your great questions. If there's more follow-up that we didn't have time to cover today, please post it in one of the channels and tag me, and I'll do my best to get to all the questions, at least the ones that I can't answer at this point. And that'll be it. So next you have a forms class with Brian, and it should be linked on the calendar. So thanks, everybody.